And of course, it's time for another episode of Jason's Game Room, the YouTube podcast where I talk about anything gaming, from board games to dice games to CCGs, video games. If it's gaming, it's here. So start listening. Today I want to talk about something that's dear to my heart, and that would be the decade of the 1990s in regards to gaming. In my humble opinion, the 1990s were some of the best times, if not it was the best decade for gaming in all aspects when you think about it. And I'm going to tell you why. Number one, video game consoles and the wars amongst said consoles and makers became huge. More options started to come out. There were more consoles, great games. Everything was being flooded with awesomeness, and it was a great time to be alive and to be a gamer because you had so many different systems to choose from. Personally, two of my favorite systems from the 90s would be the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Those left a big imprint on me in terms of video gaming. I did own both of those systems, not at the same time, mind you, because my mantra in the 90s, when I did have a few bucks, which was not very often, was I would trade up and get the next system I wanted by trading in my old equipment and go from there and pay the balance. Because I didn't come from a rich family, I didn't have a lot, so I had to think of ways to get what I wanted instead of just outright buying them. And I had the Genesis before the Super Nintendo, and I have to say that as much as I loved the Genesis for its graphics and for the simplicity of the controls, Super Nintendo had the better selection of games. And this stems from the fact that I could never get enough of Zelda or Super Metroid or Super Mario All-Stars. Those were the three main games I played. And yeah, there were lots of other games for that system that I played all the time, like SimCity, Star Fox, Stunt Race FX. There were so many good games for the Super Nintendo. I'm not trashing the Genesis. I loved the Genesis at the time. It was one of my favorite systems. But come on, the Super Nintendo just had the selection, and it had Mario. And we all grew up with Mario, and we all loved Mario. And it was one of those things we just couldn't live without. Moving along from that, one of the other great parts of the 90s obviously was the birth and the start of CCGs, also known as customizable card games. As you may well know, and I've mentioned before on this show and on the basics, Magic the Gathering started the customizable card game craze in 1993 when Wizards of the Coast came out with it. It was a game invented by one Mr. Garfield. It took off for the first couple years. Because of its popularity, a lot of other companies who maybe only published other mediums, maybe board games or toys in general, they got into the card game fix very quickly. And whereas in 1993, Magic the Gathering was pretty much the only notable card game that came out, 1994 and 1995 saw an explosion. You saw Star Trek and Star Wars CCGs come out from Decipher. X-Files CCG came out. You had Netrunner. You had Wyvern, Spellfire, Overpower. These were all heavy hitters for a period of time in the CCG world that started coming out 94, 95, 96. I'm not going to get into Pokemon because that was later, but a lot of games started coming out that were fun to play, and if you were fans of the certain mediums already existing that these games were based on, you went for them. The exception being Netrunner, because the internet was just starting to come out at that time and no one knew much about it. The Netrunner CCG, I've seen it. I've seen some of the cards. I never actually watched the game because I didn't know anybody that actually played it. Now, you have to understand, back in the 1990s, in terms of CCGs, people were pretty much playing Magic the Gathering. If I had to put a percentage, I would say 80% of CCG players were playing Magic the Gathering. 15% were playing the Star Trek CCG, as I was, and 5% were playing whatever else that was coming out, like Overpower, which that percentage grew over the next couple of years because, as I mentioned on previous shows, in terms of the Star Trek card game, it helped to be a fan. Whereas Magic, you could jump in, overpower. If you just happen to like comics or superheroes, you could jump into that game. Spellfire was a CCG that could have taken off and achieved great levels, except the rules and the gameplay were so brutally, what's the word I'm looking for? Difficult. Magic was simplistic. It was easy to play, easy to learn. Spellfire, too many rules and way too complicated. And it fizzled out very quickly, which was unfortunate because it did have promise. It was an alternative to Magic if you didn't want Magic, and it had some cool sets, but that's how it goes. And believe it or not, CCGs did start having a downturn by 96, 97. Magic had a few, actually two really bad expansions. Personally, I liked them. Fallen Empires is one of the expansions that a lot of Magic players over the years have seemingly hated. I didn't have a problem with it because I didn't have a lot of cards from that set, and the ones I did have, it didn't bother me. But CCGs as a whole took a downturn. When Decipher ended up buying more of the content for the Star Trek card game, the Star Trek card game got much better and more people started playing it. So when the expansion for First Contact came out, and that happened to be my favorite Star Trek movie and one of my favorite movies of all time, I couldn't get enough of the expansion, especially introducing the Borg affiliation. And when Deep Space Nine came out as a standalone and add-on set, and with all the affiliations added and things like that, it really expanded and heightened the game and made it so much better. Unfortunately, there are a lot of CCGs that died off. One I could never figure out why it killed off so fast was the X-Files CCG. It was only around for about 2.5 years, and then it went bye-bye. And I played it when it came out. I had a small set. I thought it was a fun game, especially being a fan of the X-Files show. And it was a different kind of card game. It was a detective-type card game. You weren't putting wizards and powers and weird shit out there. You were actually deducing things to get this done. But, you know, all good things must come to an end sooner or later. Board games were starting to come back in the 90s as well. Again, the internet wasn't a big thing in the mid-90s. It was still in the process of getting out there, so not a lot of people knew about it nor cared about it. Family board game nights were still a huge thing. My family, we used to play a lot of Monopoly. And if it wasn't Monopoly, if we didn't have the whole family there, my dad and I would usually be playing Battleship or other games. Mainly Battleship and the sub-game Salvo, which was a lot of fun. So when you look at the 90s in the grand scheme of things, it was a great time for gaming. It really was. And near the end of the 90s is when the Nintendo 64 came out and really started pushing things forward in the original PlayStation. So you had a really great decade, and I can't help but always look back at the 90s as pretty much one of the best decades out there for everything and gaming as well. Mind you, I'm a child of the 80s, and the 80s will always hold a special place in my heart. I wish I could go back to the 80s, but the 90s were great times, especially with gaming. I really wish I could time travel and go back to 1996 and just live there for a couple days and experience everything as it came out again, because it was a great time to be around. It was a great time to be a teenager, and it was a great time to be a gamer in general. I miss the 90s. I really wish we could go back to the 90s and maybe stay there. Well, I don't want to get too nostalgic, so I'm going to end the show right there. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe. I love squares! Subscribe, share, tell all your friends, and don't forget to check out the Splinter series I've started called The Basics. Get into that. It's great. And I'll see you all next time for the podcast. Everybody have a great night. And thanks for tuning in, and game on!